In 1977, Italy did something that even today sounds completely radical to most of the world.
Oh, absolutely radical.
Right. I mean, they passed a law that functionally abolished special education schools.
Just completely got rid of them.
Yeah. They didn't phase them out. They didn't, like, slowly defund them. They just decided that segregating children based on neurological or physical differences was, well, that it was fundamentally incompatible with a functioning society.
Right. And they integrated everyone into mainstream classrooms.
Exactly. And decades later, we are still grappling with the shockwaves of that kind of thinking because we are so deeply conditioned to believe that human beings, especially children, must contort their individual wiring to survive the rigid, standardized rules of our institutions.
We really are. If you can't sit still under the fluorescent lights, or if you process information a little too slowly, the prevailing wisdom has always been, well, there's something wrong with you that needs fixing.
Right. But there's this entirely different movement taking hold across Europe right now, and it flips that assumption completely upside down. Imagine walking into a space like a classroom or an office, and instead of you having to contort yourself to fit the room itself morphs and adjusts to perfectly match how your brain works.
I mean, the magnitude of that shift really cannot be overstated.
It's massive.
It is. We're looking at the difference between demanding a person alter their underlying neurology to survive an environment versus re-engineering the environment to capitalize on that person's specific neurology.
Yeah.
It challenges the whole industrial era framework as how we organize groups of people, whether we're talking about third-grade classrooms or multinational corporate offices.
So the historical default has always been mass standardization, right?
Yeah.
Just building one box and forcing everyone to fit inside it.
Exactly. And moving away from that requires an incredibly complex, highly specialized ecosystem. You can't just decree that an environment will now adapt to the individual without entirely restructuring the flow of resources and expertise.
Which brings us to the core of our deep dive today. We are looking at this really intriguing dispatch from a Japanese publication called Hakam.
Right, the publication dedicated to child rearing and developmental psychology.
Yeah, that's the one. So they've been running this investigative series on global approaches to inclusive education, and today's source material is a highly focused snapshot of that.
It's basically a window into a multi-part observational journey across Europe.
Exactly. Specifically, we're zeroing in on a report about how Belgium handles children with learning difficulties. Our mission here is to unpack a fundamental paradigm shift in special education.
Moving from forcing the child to adapt to actively adjusting the environment to suit the child.
Yeah, and we're going to explore the highly specialized ecosystem that makes that happen. So, let's set the stage. The data we're looking at comes from an observer named Mr. Tetsuya Hara.
Right, and the time frame of his data is vital. He conducted these observation tools in 2024 and 2025.
Which means this is incredibly current.
Exactly. The 2024 and 2025 window means we're analyzing active, evolving systems reacting to our most current understandings of neurodiversity. It's not a retrospective on policies from 20 years ago.
No, not at all.
Mr. Hara is looking at the absolute bleeding edge of how these European laboratories are attempting to operationalize inclusion today.
In his background is what makes his perspective so valuable, I think. He isn't like a journalist or just a casual observer.
Right, he's a professional in the field.
Yeah, he spent his entire career in the education and treatment of children with developmental disorders. And he holds dual credentials. He's both a speech-language hearing therapist and a social worker.
Which is such a unique combination.
It really is. Those two distinct fields of expertise usually operate in entirely different orbits. Bringing them together to analyze a school system creates this really unique analytical friction.
The friction between those two disciplines is the key to unpacking his observations, really, because the speech-language hearing therapist operates predominantly within the medical and clinical model. Through that lens, you're analyzing the micromechanics of human cognition and physiology. A therapist evaluates phonological processing, working memory bottlenecks, semantic comprehension, all the neurological hurdles a child faces when trying to decode the world around them.
It's a highly individualized, pathology-focused view. You're looking squarely at the child's internal apparatus and asking, how is this specific brain processing this specific input?
Exactly. While the social worker lens pulls the camera all the way back.
Yeah, way back.
It operates on the social model of disability, which argues that a person isn't disabled by their neurology, but by the barriers present in society.
The systemic scaffolding around the child.
Right. A social worker evaluates family stressors, economic resource allocation, community integration, and institutional rigidity.
And putting those two lenses together is remarkably rare.
It's almost unheard of. Typically, clinical professionals and systemic professionals operate in complete silos. The therapist works in a clinic, diagnosing a processing delay and recommending interventions.
While the social worker navigates the school board, or the family court, or the community resource center.
Exactly. So when Mr. Hara walks into a school in Belgium, Denmark, or Italy, he is simultaneously running a clinical diagnostic of the child's cognitive experience and mapping the systemic architecture of the classroom itself.
He can see exactly where the individual's neurology collides with the institution's rigidity. I like to think of it like an analogy. It's the equivalent of having an architect evaluate the structural integrity of a building's foundation, while an interior designer evaluates how hostile or welcoming the space is for the family actually living in it.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right. You only get a complete picture of the building's success if you understand both the load-bearing mechanics and the daily human flow.
And Mr. Hara is evaluating the load-bearing mechanics of these educational policies alongside the daily human reality of the students.
Yeah. But I do want to push back on his itinerary for a second. Over the 2024 and 2025 period, he specifically targeted Denmark, Italy, and Belgium.
He did?
The choice of those three nations seems highly deliberate. But culturally, politically, and economically, Denmark, Italy, and Belgium operate on very different frequencies.
Very different.
I mean, Italy has that radical history of absolute integration from the 70s. Denmark operates on a deeply rooted tradition of social pedagogy, placing massive emphasis on community welfare over raw academic metrics.
Right, and then Belgium has its own complex, highly regionalized educational structure.
Exactly. So treating them as a unified European bloc in a study like this, does that risk flattening the distinct mechanisms they're using? Are we looking at a broad European consensus here, or three completely separate laboratories running different experiments?
Well, we are definitely looking at separate laboratories testing fundamentally different variables. There really is no unified European consensus on the execution of inclusion.
Right.
There's only a shared theoretical mandate driven by international human rights frameworks. Italy's model of total immersion relies on the sheer force of social exposure and dedicated support teachers in every room.
Yeah.
Denmark focuses heavily on emotional well-being and democratic participation as the primary goals of schooling. They often utilize specialized, highly resourced environments that might still be somewhat separate from the mainstream.
Got it. So they all have their own flavor.
Exactly. But Belgium, however, offers a distinct third path. And that's what this specific dispatch, part 2 of the How Come series, really zeroes in on. Mr. Hara's focus on Belgium centers on a very specific operational philosophy regarding environmental control.
Right, moving into the Belgian philosophy, re-engineering the environment. The central finding from the Belgian model is that they abandon the attempt to mold the child's neurology.
They do. It's a profound shift.
It is. The directive is that when a child experiences learning difficulties, the system does not attempt to fix the child. Rather, the environment is adjusted to suit the child.
The child becomes the constant, and the environment becomes the variable.
Exactly. And to appreciate the gravity of that approach, we have to look at the architecture of the system it's replacing. Because almost all modern education systems were built on the deficit model.
Yeah. And the deficit model is an inheritance of the Industrial Revolution, really. It's heavily influenced by Taylorism, the idea that you can optimize human behavior for maximum efficiency by establishing rigid, standardized processes.
Assembly line thinking.
Exactly. In education, this translated to standardizing the curriculum, standardizing the testing, standardizing the physical space, and standardizing the acceptable behavioral output.
So the system establishes this completely arbitrary baseline of normal. And if a child's brain operates outside that narrow bandwidth, say they struggle to process written text quickly, or their sensory processing system is overwhelmed by the noise of 30 other kids.
The system identifies a deficit within the individual.
Right. The subsequent interventions are all designed to bridge the gap between the child's natural state and the artificial baseline.
The interventions are entirely corrective. We deploy medication, behavioral conditioning, punitive grading, or isolated tutoring, all with the singular goal of forcing the child to mimic the standardized baseline.
It's wild when you say it out loud. The environment, the 40-minute class periods, the fluorescent lighting, the text-heavy instruction, it's treated as an immutable law of physics.
Right, the environment is the constant. The child's neurology is treated as a variable that must be manipulated until it complies.
But the Belgian philosophy flips those variables entirely. The child's neurology, their sensory thresholds, their processing speed, those are accepted as the immutable realities.
Yes, so if a child cannot focus in a loud room, the Belgian model does not view the child as having a focusing deficit. It views the room as having a noise surplus.
A noise surplus, I love that phrasing. The friction is still recognized, but the burden of adaptation is shifted from the individual to the institution.
And that shift requires a comprehensive redefinition of what an environment actually is in a learning context, because it's not just the physical space.
Right, though the physical environment is the most visible layer, obviously. The acoustics in a room, the visual clutter on the walls, the lighting, the type of seating provided.
Yeah, for a neurodivergent child, a classroom with echoing hard surfaces, bright overhead lights, and rigid wooden chairs isn't just uncomfortable, it is neurologically overwhelming.
Absolutely. The sensory gating mechanisms in their brain are forced to expend massive amounts of energy just to filter out the ambient noise.
Leaving zero cognitive bandwidth for actual learning.
Exactly. So adjusting that physical environment is step one. But the instructional environment is where the real complexity lies, right? If the physical environment is the room, the instructional environment is the language spoken inside it.
That's a great way to frame it. The instructional environment dictates how information is encoded by the teacher and decoded by the student. Under a standardized model, it's usually monolithic.
The teacher lectures verbally, and the student proves their comprehension through a written exam.
Right, and if a student has severe dyslexia or an auditory processing disorder, that specific instructional environment creates an artificial barrier.
Because the student might possess a profound understanding of the historical event being taught, but the environment they demonstrate that understanding through a medium their brain struggles to process.
Exactly. So adjusting the instructional environment means dismantling that bottleneck. It requires implementing multiple means of representation.
Like what does that look like in practice?
Well, if the goal is to assess a student's understanding of cellular biology, the environment can be adjusted to allow the student to build a 3D model, record a verbal presentation, or code a simulation.
Oh.
Right. The academic rigor remains intact, but the method of interaction adapts to the user.
That makes so much sense. And then you have the temporal environment, which I think is perhaps the most rigidly enforced constraint in modern schooling.
Oh, without a doubt. The temporal environment governs the pace of learning. We arbitrarily decide that a specific mathematical concept must be mastered within a 3-week unit and demonstrated in a 45-minute testing window.
Which completely ignores the biological reality of learning.
Yeah.
I mean, the metabolic rate at which a brain consolidates new neural pathways varies wildly from person to person.
It does. Some individuals are incredibly deep associative thinkers who require significant time to map new information onto their existing knowledge structures.
Right.
And in a standardized temporal environment, their deep processing is penalized as slowness.
So adjusting the temporal environment means removing the artificial scarcity of time, allowing a student to engage with the material at the speed their neurology dictates, recognizing that speed is not a proxy for intelligence.
Exactly.
The logic of adjusting these environments becomes incredibly obvious when you strip away the context of human education and look at basic biology.
What do you mean?
Well, think of a shade-loving fern. It's a plant biologically adapted to thrive in cool, humid, indirect light.
Okay.
If you take that fern and you plant it in the middle of a scorching desert, the fern will begin to wither. Now, the deficit model looks at the wilting fern and diagnoses a failure to thrive.
Right.
We create an intervention plan for the fern. We give it extra tutoring in desert survival. We set behavioral goals for it to stand up straighter under the midday sun.
And none of those interventions address the fundamental incompatibility between the organism's biology and the environment's demands. The interventions are exhausting for the fern and ultimately futile.
Exactly. But the environmental adjustment approach recognizes that there is absolutely nothing wrong with the fern. It's a perfectly functioning organism. The problem is the blistering sun.
So the solution isn't to fix the fern, the solution is to build a canopy.
Yes. You adjust the humidity, you alter the light, you change the environment to match the biological reality of the organism, and the organism naturally flourishes.
That's a brilliant analogy. The challenge, however, is that building a bespoke canopy for every single plant in a massive agricultural system requires an astronomical level of specialized labor and observation.
Yeah, that's the catch.
Translating this philosophy into a school system of thousands of students is where the theoretical beauty of environmental adjustment collides with the brutal reality of resource management.
Totally.
Hmm.
I mean, advocating for physical, instructional, and temporal adjustments sounds utopian. But the reality of a modern mainstream classroom is a single teacher managing 25 to 30 distinct human brains simultaneously.
Right.
Expecting a general education teacher to independently diagnose the nuanced sensory thresholds, cognitive processing bottlenecks, and temporal needs of every single student,
Hmm.
and then dynamically adjust the environment in real time. That's a mathematical impossibility. It's a recipe for severe educator burnout.
Oh, absolutely. A philosophy of environmental adaptation is entirely useless without a functional operational mechanism to execute it.
Right.
General education teachers are experts in pedagogy, curriculum design, and group management. They are not clinical diagnosticians. Asking them to shoulder the entire burden of environmental adaptation is why so many inclusive education initiatives fail in practice.
Which brings us to Section 3, Expertise in Action. The HUCM dispatch highlights the specific mechanism Belgium utilizes to bridge this exact gap.
Yes, the power of stationed professionals.
Right. The dispatch notes that Belgium's model is defined by special needs education accompanied by expertise, and the critical detail is that these professionals are stationed directly within the educational setting.
That word stationed completely alters the logistical flow of how support is provided.
How so? Like, how does having a professional stationed change the dynamic? Doesn't that sort of blur the line between a school and a clinic?
It does, but in a necessary way. The contrast between a stationed professional and an external consultant is essentially the difference between preventative care and crisis triage.
Oh, okay.
In traditional educational models, clinical expertise is heavily centralized and externalized. Speech-language pathologists, occupational therapists, educational psychologists, they usually operate out of a central district office or a private clinic.
So they exist outside the daily ecosystem of the student.
Exactly. The student spends the vast majority of their time in the mainstream classroom with the general education teacher. And when the standardized environment inevitably clashes with the student's neurology, friction occurs.
Right.
This friction usually manifests as academic failure, behavioral outbursts, or severe withdrawal. At that point, the teacher initiates a referral process, which triggers a whole bureaucratic chain of events.
And weeks, or often months later, the external specialist finally arrives at the school.
Right. The specialist acts as a visiting dignitary. They pull the student out of the classroom, conduct an assessment in an isolated room, draft a comprehensive report detailing the child's deficits, provide a list of recommended environmental adjustments, and then they leave.
And the general education teacher is then handed this multi-page technical document and expected to implement the recommended adjustments on top of their existing workload without any ongoing support.
The feedback loop is completely broken.
It really is. The assessment happened in a vacuum, completely divorced from the dynamic chaos of the actual classroom environment where the friction actually occurs. By the time the report is delivered, the child's needs may have already shifted.
Or the specific dynamic that caused the original friction may have evolved. The external consultant model is inherently reactive.
Yeah.
You have to wait for the child to actively fail or suffer before the expertise is deployed.
Wow. So stationing the professionals directly inside the educational setting dismantles that entire triage process.
Completely. Embedded expertise means the clinical and systemic observers are part of the daily fabric of the school. The occupational therapist isn't a visitor. They are a resident. They're walking the halls, observing the cafeteria, sitting in the back of the math class.
The implications of that proximity are massive. When the expertise is stationed in the room, the intervention can become microscopic and preventative.
Exactly. A stationed professional can observe the cascading precursors to a crisis. They can see that a student isn't having a behavioral meltdown because they are defiant. They are having a meltdown because at 10:15 a.m., the glare from the window hit their desk, causing visual overstimulation.
Right.
At 10:20 a.m., the instructional environment shifted to rapid-fire verbal questioning, exceeding their processing speed. By 10:30 a.m., the cognitive load was breached, resulting in a meltdown.
And the external consultant only ever sees the 10:30 a.m. meltdown.
Right. But the station professional sees the 10:15 a.m. glare. And because they are stationed in the room, they don't have to write a referral. They can simply walk over and adjust the blinds.
They can subtly alter the instructional flow. They can adjust the environment in real time, catching the spark before it becomes a forest fire. That's
Yeah.
incredible.
This ongoing collaboration between the general educator and the station professional creates a deeply robust instructional ecosystem. The teacher provides the pedagogical framework, and the station professional provides the real-time neuroenvironmental tuning.
They co-create the space dynamically. So if a lesson plan isn't landing, the station professional can immediately analyze the instructional environment, identify the cognitive bottleneck, and suggest an alternative means of representation on the spot.
Yes, blurring the lines between the school and the clinic in this way does raise questions about the overarching purpose of the institution. But if we are embedding occupational therapists, speech-language pathologists, and social workers directly into the classrooms, the school is no longer just an academic training facility.
It morphs into a holistic developmental ecosystem.
Exactly. The historical separation between academic learning and neurological development is an artificial boundary. A brain cannot encode complex mathematical formulas if its sensory gating mechanisms are currently under siege by the acoustic environment.
Right, you cannot separate the clinical reality of the child from their academic potential.
Embedding the expertise directly where the learning happens acknowledges that environmental adaptation is a continuous, iterative process, not a one-time structural fix.
This operational reality perfectly explains why Mr. Hara found this specific aspect of the Belgian system so compelling. Returning to his dual background as a speech-language hearing therapist and a social worker, his entire professional existence likely sits right on the fault line of this problem.
Oh, without a doubt. As a clinician working in Japan, he is likely acutely aware of the limitations of the external consultant model.
Yeah.
He possesses the expertise to diagnose the precise neurological hurdles a child is facing. He can map out the exact environmental adjustments required for that child to thrive.
But if he's operating from an external clinic, he experiences the profound frustration of sending that child back into a rigid, standardized school environment, fully knowing that the school lacks the embedded expertise to actually implement his recommendations.
He knows the child is going to wither, not because the diagnosis is wrong, but because the environment remains unyielding.
So witnessing a system where clinical and systemic expertise is permanently stationed within the educational setting must be entirely paradigm shifting for a professional in his position.
It validates the understanding that inclusive education cannot be achieved through policy mandates or goodwill alone. True inclusion is a highly technical, aggressively resourced structural commitment.
It requires taking the specialized knowledge out of the siloed clinics and embedding it deeply into the soil where the growth is actually expected to happen.
Beautifully said.
So, synthesizing all of this, the Hookham Dispatch serves as a powerful piece of evidence that the transition from a deficit model to an environmental adjustment model is mechanically possible, provided the society is willing to fund the station expertise required to maintain it.
Right.
Through the dual lens of Mr. Hara's 2024 and 2025 observations, the Belgian approach proves that we don't have to accept the standardized environment as an immutable constant. We can treat the individual's neurology as the constant and build a room around it.
And the implications of that philosophy extend far beyond the parameters of special education in Europe, because the deficit model is not confined to our school systems.
No, it's the dominant operating system of modern adulthood.
It really is. Think about your own office right now. The listener navigating their own professional or personal life is almost certainly operating under the weight of a deficit model. We carry that industrial-era standardization out of the classroom and directly into the corporate office.
Absolutely. When an adult struggles in a modern workplace, perhaps it's an open-plan office that creates constant auditory interruptions, or a corporate culture that values immediate, rapid-fire responses over deep, methodical analysis, the default psychological response is to internalize that friction as a personal failure.
We assume we lack discipline or focus or drive.
Exactly. We purchase productivity systems, we attempt to biohack our sleep, we medicate our anxiety, all in a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between our natural neurology and the rigid demands of the corporate environment.
We spend our entire adult lives trying to force ourselves to survive in the scorching desert, blaming ourselves every time our leaves turn brown.
Yes. We never stop to question why the desert is the only accepted environment for professional success. The Belgian philosophy offers a radical framework for self-advocacy.
It really does. The friction you're experiencing might not be a symptom of a personal deficit. You might simply be operating in an environment that is deeply hostile to your natural working style.
Recognizing the distinction between a personal deficit and environmental friction is the first step toward reclaiming agency.
It allows you to shift your energy away from endless, exhausting self-correction and toward actively advocating for or creating the environmental adjustments that you actually need to function optimally, whether those are physical, instructional, or temporal.
Which leaves us with a really compelling final thought to examine as we wrap up this deep dive. We look at the Belgian model for children, and we marvel at the compassion and logic of molding the environment to fit the diverse, complex neurology of the developing brain.
Right. We recognize the profound human potential that's unlocked when we stop trying to standardize human beings.
So, at what specific point in our societal timeline did we decide that adults must forfeit this accommodation?
Wow.
When did we collectively agree that the moment you enter the workforce, the environment becomes the immutable constant, and you must endlessly manipulate yourself to fit it?
It's a tragedy, really. Imagine the sheer volume of intellectual capital and creative output that is currently being suffocated by standardized corporate environments.
If businesses adopted the philosophy of environmental adjustment, not just as a peripheral human resources perk, but as the core operational strategy for extracting maximum value from neurodiverse minds, the economic and cultural shifts would be staggering.
Staggering.
Consider the environment you are expected to perform in tomorrow. Are you failing the room, or is the room failing you? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.